Are you in college? The Thomistic Institute Study Abroad program is now accepting applications for the spring semester of 2024. This unique and exciting study abroad program offers you the opportunity to spend a semester in Rome at the Dominican Order's Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas. You'll study the ancient and medieval intellectual tradition of Rome, live with like-minded young men and women steps from the Colosseum, and participate in weekly cultural and intellectual events, regular day trips, and multi-day excursions. To learn more about this life-changing opportunity, go to ThomisticInstitute.org/Rome. That's ThomisticInstitute.org/Rome. Welcome to the Thomistic Institute podcast. Our mission is to promote the Catholic intellectual tradition in the university, the church, and the wider public square. The lectures on this podcast are organized by university students at Thomistic Institute chapters around the world. To learn more and to attend these events, visit us at ThomisticInstitute.org.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you to everyone who came out to join us for the lecture tonight. We're really excited to have you all. Let me go ahead and introduce our speaker, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Joe McInerney is the Director of Leadership and Ethics Education for the Knights of Columbus, a worldwide fraternal association of more than 2 million members with headquarters in New Haven, Connecticut. Prior to retiring as a captain from the United States Navy, he stood as the chairman of the Department of Leadership, Ethics, and Law, and as permanent military professor of applied ethics and leadership at the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. After working in a variety of leadership positions in the Navy, Captain McInerney was selected for the Navy's Permanent Military Professor Program. As a member of that program, he graduated from the Catholic University of America with a doctorate in systematic theology. Captain McInerney also holds a bachelor's degree in history from the United States Naval Academy and a Masters of Theological Studies from the John Paul II Institute in Washington, D.C. A writer of both academic and popular essays, Captain McInerney is also author of The Greatness of Humility, St. Augustine on Moral Excellence, and Passion and Paradox, The Leadership Genius of Jesus Christ. His most recent book, From Achilles to Superman, A Leader's Guide to the History of Ethics, is under review for publication with the Catholic University of America Press. Please join me in welcoming Captain McInerney.
So good evening, everybody. It's so good to be here. I need to thank Katie in particular for all the help that you've offered to get me here, and NC State has been very gracious in its welcome. Andy also for helping show me around the campus this afternoon. So, and also I have to thank the Thomistic Institute for giving me the opportunity to come down here to speak. They fund all this. They fund my travel, and so I feel honored that they think I actually have something worth saying to other people. So hopefully all of you think that too. But it's interesting. So I got this PhD. People say PhD stands for pile higher and deeper. So hopefully we won't do too much of that tonight. But it's in systematic theology, which is interesting. Like if you ask academic systematic theologians what is systematic theology, they really struggle to tell you what it actually is. What's the discipline? And so I'm going to probably do that too. But I'm going to define it. But I also think that I realized after putting this, I was telling Katie, I kind of spliced a couple of talks together here. This is actually a presentation of systematic theology. So what systematic theology does is it looks at divine revelation, Scripture, the Bible, and organizes it into themes. It tries to draw points out of the text, so to speak, but it's also in dialogue with other disciplines. And so, talking in philosophical terms or maybe psychological terms, even some systematic theologians are really engaging with science and contemporary literature. So this is going to be some of that. It's going to be a little bit of a mix of theology and philosophy. So a very good friend of mine is a very, very accomplished public speaker, and he said, the first thing you got to do is you got to relate to your audience. So I'm gonna try and do that, but I'm realizing that the things that I'm going to do are probably going to alienate me from you. But I'm just gonna do it anyway. So the first thing I wanted to do is my mission in life often is to try and embarrass my family as much as possible. So this is my niece, Priya, who's in the second row, right? So she came and joined here. And this is the alienation part. She's a grad student at Chapel Hill. So she's going to be, a member of the Wipf pack tonight with me. And she hangs around with very disreputable people. That's my son, Patrick, there. So, so you might want to keep your distance a little bit. But so I was trying to think of NC State. I've been here once before, but I was trying to think of, how I've connected with NC State before. So in the previous slide, actually, also I do have to point out, going the wrong way. I am retired, so that's a nice way of saying I'm old, right? A lot of people, they say I look young, but that's just because they want things from me. So I'm going to prove that I am old with this aspect of it. So I have actually very strong negative emotional ties to NC State. So I'm just going to throw it out there. I do, because I'm going to date myself. So does anybody in this room know that NC State won the national basketball title in 1983? All right, are you familiar with that? Is that something? I mean, the institution knows that, right? Like everybody knows that, right? Right. So how many people were alive in 1983 to watch NC State win that in this room? Anybody? I am really, by definition, really old. So I was old. I was 13 at the time. So I grew up in New York, and I was a St. John's fan. And St. John's did what they normally do that year when they get to the tournament. They lost almost immediately. So then I was looking around for other teams, and the team I landed on was the University of Houston, because they were amazing. They were unbelievable. I mean, and so it was like St. John's, they always found a way to lose. And so this was Houston. They like half their team went to the NBA, literally, actually. So I was like, I can't lose with this. So I'm definitely just riding the bandwagon. And they went all the way through the playoffs, or through the NCAA tournament, until they met NC State. And NC State beats them in the most exciting game. 40 years later, I can say it was a great game or whatever. And one of the most exciting games I've ever seen. And I was absolutely crushed, even though I couldn't even spell Houston. Never been to Texas or anything like that. But I had attached myself emotionally to being a winner. And I wasn't. It was NC State. So I just wanted to let you know. I've been working with my therapist about this, so everything's good. We're going to do fine. So anyway, so that's my connection with NC State. It is really interesting how you get attached to this. Those are very, very clear memories for me. Not that you really care, but anyway. So that's my attempt to relate to my audience. So that's my niece Priya. She's much more interesting than me, so hopefully you get to talk to her at the end of the day. So we're going to talk about the glory of leadership. And just to start out, so this is one of my best. So I told you we're going to do theology and philosophy. One of the best philosophers I know, Michael Scott. I don't know if all of you are familiar with him, but so why talk about glory and leadership? Because leaders that are focused on glory, they end up like him, right? And so it seems like, we, especially in the Christian tradition, we like to talk about servant leadership and humble leaders and things like that. So it seems like glory might be to talk about that or focus on that might be, contrary to those trends. And so it's interesting to answer the question briefly is that, well, leaders end up getting glorified a lot of times. Like, it's interesting. Like if you look at famous people in history, many times, they might be, famous people in history might have some kind of genius, but a lot of times they're leaders, whether political leaders, military leaders, religious leaders. But leadership draws attention, and it can draw glory, for good or for bad. And so it's an interesting phenomenon, and so I want to take a look at it, and it's an idea that's actually quite biblical and quite scriptural too. So I kind of want to delve into that in this talk. So how will I do that? So just a quick path here. What I want to do is talk about leading with the mind of Christ, so to speak. And so, and in doing that, put that in the context of virtue. So my background, I do a lot of work with a classical approach to ethics, a classical approach to moral theology, which is also a deep part of the Christian tradition too. And so that's a virtue-based approach. So prudence is the key moral virtue. It's actually another way to translate prudence from the Greek is practical wisdom, and that's prudence has a little bit of a negative connotation in English, so I like to do practical wisdom. But take a look at that and how the practical wisdom of Jesus leads him to look at his mission. Then we want to take a look at these two other virtues, magnanimity and humility. And we'll go into that for a little while, and then bring that back, to look at the glory of God's leadership, glory of Christ's leadership in that context. So hopefully that makes sense. What's interesting about leadership, it's kind of complicated, and that's why if you go into contemporary leadership literature, there's like more than 40 systematic theories of leadership. There's over 1,000 definitions of leadership, right? And it seems like there's a lot of confusion about leadership, and it is interesting because there can be a science to it, but it's also an art form, and a lot of times people think they're doing it right, but maybe they're not doing it that well. And I think talking about the virtues is a helpful way to get leadership right. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the virtues tonight, so if you want to hear about that, you just have to invite me back. But so that's kind of the background. But just to define virtue, and one last comment, administrative comment. If anybody has a question or wants to make a comment, I'm very happy to. That's kind of what I was used to teaching in the Navy. So please feel free to stop me if I'm saying something crazy or if there's something that you'd like to comment on. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time on virtue, but just to define it very briefly, virtue simply is an excellent habit, an excellent moral habit, typically. A vice is the opposite, and that's a bad habit, okay? So we're going to take a look at Jesus' leadership in the context of virtue. So leading with the mind of Christ. And again, so in a virtue-based approach, we have this idea of prudence. Prudence is the key moral virtue. According to Aristotle, prudence is actually an intellectual virtue, but it guides the moral life. Every virtue. So these are the four cardinal virtues that this is a strong consensus coming down from antiquity, both in philosophical and theological context. Say, hey, these are the four cardinal virtues: practical wisdom or prudence, justice. The prudence is the ability to figure out what you need to do and how to do it. Justice is the ability to give what's due to another person. Temperance is your ability to control your desire for pleasure. And then courage is your ability to face danger or fear in the right way. Okay? So practical wisdom is the key virtue because you can't do any of these other three. And these are called cardinal virtues. In the background of cardinus, in the Latin, the word is hinge. And so all the other virtues can kind of line up underneath these virtues. And we'll see an example of that later on. So it's not to say that these are the only four virtues, and we also in the Christian tradition we have theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. But the cardinal virtues, none of them can operate without practical wisdom. So to be courageous, to do the brave thing in a specific situation, and not be cowardly on one side or not be reckless on the other, you need practical wisdom. You need to figure out what's the right path to do the courageous things. So prudence is this ability to not only know what's right, so that's part of it. It's kind of a twofold approach. It's the ability to figure out how to do what's right also. Okay. So for Aristotle, he described prudence as the mark of virtue is the ability to do the right thing at the right time in the right way to the right person, so to speak. And so prudence is crucial to be able to do all those things. To be able to do all those things is really difficult. It's kind of like hitting the bullseye, so to speak. So you can't hit the bullseye without practical wisdom. Or the habit of practical wisdom. And just one last thing from the last slide, sorry. So practical wisdom enables us to figure out what things should be accomplished and the way to make those things happen, right? And so when we take a look at the person of Jesus in the Gospels, so what's his mission? His mission is to reconcile the world to the Father. So it's kind of a big mission, right? So it's salvation of all humanity. So what's interesting is that it's a big job. So he's kind of taking it on. We're going to talk about that in the context of his magnanimity. But in the context of prudence, and if you look at the gospel narratives, he doesn't seem very prudent. He seems kind of reckless, actually. So he chooses his friends poorly, at least from the world's perspective. He doesn't choose powerful people. He doesn't choose educated people. He doesn't choose rich people. A bunch of fishermen and a bunch of other ragtag people following him along. And then he constantly goads the authorities of his time. He's constantly challenging them all the time. He's saying, he tells them he can forgive sins. He tells them he's Lord of the Sabbath. He actually, in all four Gospels, you see him cleansing the temple, which is, really going to the heart of the religious authority of that community and saying, oh, you guys got it all wrong. And so he's constantly pushing the authorities, and he's got no backup. It's not like the apostles or the disciples are a bunch of fighters. They're not. But he's pushing against authorities that literally do have physical force in the Romans, but also the religious authorities can get the Romans to do what they want, which we see in the climax of the Gospels, right? So what's he doing? Why is he doing this? And it's interesting. So I think it makes sense in the context of his mission. So this is, and just one other caveat. Everything I say in here, none of it's original. So this analysis that I'm going to tell you right now, I think it's brilliant. And I can say that because it's not mine. So it's coming from a guy named Raymond Schwager. Father Schwager is a Jesuit priest in Austria. He just passed away a few years ago. But he has an analysis on he asks the question, why doesn't Jesus come down from the cross? He's got all these people taunting him and telling him come down from the cross. And if you're a Christian, you believe that he's the second person of the Holy Trinity, he's God incarnate, he's got the power to come down from the cross. So why doesn't he come down from the cross? It's an interesting question. His analysis on his answer to that I found really compelling, which I'll go through in a second. So, but what he starts from this passage from the Gospel, which is very familiar to us. If you ever watch, you see John 3:16 behind the field goal of football games. It might even happen in NC State Stadium. They hold that sign up, and this is what it says: "For God so loved the world that He gave His only Son, so that everyone who believes in Him might not perish but might have eternal life. For God did not send His Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world might be saved through Him." So what's interesting here is that and what Father Schwager points out is that he interprets the mission of Christ is to overcome and overturn an interpretation of the Torah, the law at the time. Is that what the religious authorities did is they were very scrupulous readers of the law, and they expected everybody to not only obey the spirit of the law, but the letter of the law. And if people didn't obey the letter of the law, well, they would condemn those people. And they would even unleash violence on those people. And you see this in John chapter 8, you have the scene of the woman caught in adultery. And so this is a typical example of what do you do with the woman caught in adultery? Well, you stone her, right? And so it's interesting in that example, it's fascinating because Jesus says, okay, the famous line, who among you is without sin, that person can cast the first stone. And so they all just kind of walk away. But what Father Schwager says is that, and he introduces his analysis by saying, Christ, according to Scripture, has come to judge the world, and it's in part of his initial proclamation of the gospel is repent. So judgment is embedded in his message, and then Scripture says all judgment has been handed over to the Son by the Father. So you have the just judge of the world comes, and instead of judging, he gets judged and he gets condemned. But the reality is that it's his own fault. He's the one that provoked the judgment, which is kind of interesting. So he's constantly challenging the religious authorities in ways that they were going to find very upsetting, because he knew they would do what they do. They judge and they condemn. And they judge and they condemn, and he knew they would do that to him, and they would condemn him to violence and even death. And so what's really interesting is that you see this being brought out in the narrative constantly. And then at the climax of the gospel narratives and the passion narratives that we're all so familiar with, when Jesus is in the seat being judged, and they can't get the testimony of all the witnesses to line up, then the high priest says, well, are you the Messiah? And he says, yes, I am. So here's the guy that's always running circles around his interlocutors and his adversaries. When it counts most, he gives them the evidence that they want to condemn him. And so what's really interesting is that the reason he's doing this, according to Father Schwager, and I think it's really interesting, is that he's living out what he taught in the Sermon on the Mount. So the Sermon on the Mount, if people remember, he says crazy stuff there that people would say, well, you're not going to do that. If you do what he says in the Sermon on the Mount, you're just going to get run over by this world. He says things like, love your enemy, pray for those who persecute you. If they take your coat, give them your other coat. And, if they want you to walk a mile, walk 2 miles. Turn the other cheek. He says all that stuff, but who's going to listen to him if he doesn't live it out, right? And so he provokes a confrontation where he knows he's going to be judged. And then the question comes, what does God do in the face of his enemies? What does he do when people hate him and attack him? And he does exactly what he said in the Sermon on the Mount. He goes on the cross and he prays for the people that are persecuting him and putting him to death. So it's really interesting is that, and Father Schwager says, hey, he's not only does he preach a high standard of morality, his behavior actually eclipses that standard in what he does. And St. Paul in the letter to the Romans has this nice comment about the uniqueness of the sacrifice of the cross. And St. Paul says, some people will be willing to die sometimes. Some very brave people are willing to die for people that they love. But what's unique about Christ's sacrifice is that he died for people that he loved, he died for people that were indifferent to him, and he died for people that actually hated him also, the very people that were putting him on that cross. And so this is a very unique thing that Father Schwager says, but this is the logical conclusion of Jesus' teaching, that the only way for him to get it across, not only to his adversaries, who, to be frank, are probably not going to listen, but most importantly to his followers, is that this is the life I'm calling you to. I don't know why they would follow. It doesn't seem all that attractive, but it does end in glory in the resurrection. But he had to live it out, so to speak. And so the gospel narratives, in part, are demonstrating that conflict. He creates the conflict, and so he can live out that reality to accomplish that mission, right? So he it doesn't seem prudent in the typical sense, but when it comes to knowing what he has to do and figuring out how to do it, that's his practical wisdom at work. He's doing things. He's in conflict with the religious authorities, but he knows that that's a conflict that's the only way he can accomplish his mission. So within that mission and within all that back and forth, I think we can see two virtues at work. This virtue of magnanimity, which is a hard word because it's hard to say. I've been saying a lot, so I get a lot of practice. Does anybody know? So the opposite of magnanimity is not humility, actually. So the opposite of magnanimity is a word I still can't say because I don't say it enough. Does anybody know what it is?
Pusillanimity.
Yeah. Can you say it? Pusillanimity. Right. So that's magnanimity philosophically, and so I'm using a philosophical definition of the term, which is a little different than just the plain use of the word magnanimous. But philosophically, magnanimity. Well, we'll see what it is in a minute. We'll see how Aristotle describes it. But pusillanimity, close enough, is thinking too lowly, small. Thinking of yourself less than is appropriate or less than it's accurate, which is different than humility. Hopefully that'll come out. So what's interesting, so I did my, as Katie read that kind biography of me. By the way, that biography makes me sound really good. If you ever need to find out what the real Joe is like, I'll just give you my wife's number and she can tell you all the issues. And Priya actually have family here, so you can attest to everything. So, but maybe we'll just have to whisk you out of the room later. So I got to the Naval Academy after studying at Catholic University, and my dissertation was on the virtue of humility in St. Augustine's thought. And so as soon as I got there, I was one of my future colleagues, I just met him, very, very bright guy and very gregarious guy, sits down. He's like, "Oh, you're the humility dude. It's kind of hard to brag about your humility, right?" So I was like, "Yeah, I guess you can put it that way." He's like, "Well, do good leaders, do they need to be proud or humble?" And I was like, I don't know. I never asked that question before. And it was interesting. We were teaching this ethics course, and we had readings from primary sources, one of which was Aristotle. And so the Aristotle reading was was an excerpt from his Ethics, and the title of it was "Pride, the Greatest Virtue." Okay, and so that's obviously a little different than the Christian tradition. And so I had to think about that a bit, and so I had to figure this out. So I've been thinking about it, and it's interesting. So here are two historical leaders that seem to personify the question. So Alexander the Great, he named, I think, 70 cities after himself, right? So, but he did name one after his horse. So he's not totally, his horse's name is Bucephalus. So some useless information. But after I heard that stat, I had to find out the horse's name. So 70 cities after yourself. He's pretty thinks kind of highly of himself. Actually, so it's interesting. So there's a Scottish historian who described Alexander's mindset, and he said, Alexander strode about the world, and wherever he went, wherever he found humans, he felt he found subjects. It's that everybody was below him, so to speak, right? So that's very different from a guy like Gandhi. Gandhi, he would do nonviolent protests, end up in jail a lot. He lived in a hut. He made his own clothes. He was not, he's not a figure of grandeur, so to speak. So, but these are obviously two very influential leaders in history, two very different approaches to things. So it kind of brought the question back to me: are great leaders proud or humble, right? And so these two represent two intellectual traditions, actually, too. So Aristotle was Alexander's tutor, actually, for 2 years. So Aristotle taught on this idea of magnanimity, which is an English translation, and all the translation stuff kind of confuses the question. And then we have a person like C.S. Lewis. So C.S. Lewis is, most people are familiar with him. They did the Narnia movies, and he was a professor at Oxford and Cambridge, an English professor, but did write a lot of Christian work. Started out as an atheist and Mere Christianity. People might be familiar with, documents his, he kind of does his spiritual biography of how he converts. So he talks about, so in our readings in that course, we had Aristotle on pride is the greatest virtue, and C.S. Lewis literally an article, pride is the greatest sin. So it's like, okay, what's up with that? We got these two really smart people saying literally the exact opposite. So let's take a look at what Aristotle had to say, and then we'll take a look at what Lewis had to say. So Aristotle on the proud. Basically, they are good, and they know it. Literally, that was his formulation. So the Greek term is megalopsychos, greatness, and great, megalo, great, and then psychos is soul. So great soul, you could say, is the literal translation. And so that person, the great souled person, is somebody who is truly has the virtues, and they understand that they truly have the virtues, and because of that, they think they deserve great honors because they're truly wonderful, right? So it's just an accurate statement of who they are. So it's really interesting. So St. Thomas Aquinas is a great Christian thinker who spends a lot of time with Aristotle and kind of cleans up some of the rough edges. But what St. Thomas says is that there's a real insight here. Is that to be a good person is you have to recognize the talents that you have, so to speak, and then on the basis of that recognition, you then do great tasks that will further refine the talents that you have. So for Aristotle, the magnanimous person is able to, they recognize their strengths, and then they take on great tasks, and in doing so, they become better because they take on these great challenges, so to speak. So they're concerned with honor. So honor is the greatest external good for Aristotle because you give honor to the gods. So the magnanimous person, they're trying to be godlike, kind of. And so they're focused on honor. So he says pride makes the other virtues greater. So they don't do a lot. They only do great deeds. So it's interesting. So according to St. Thomas, he's got a good initial insight, and then he gets into some less good observations. So he says they're dignified and unassuming. He says the magnanimous person gives but doesn't receive, which that sounds pretty nice, right? It sounds almost generous. But he goes into much greater detail and says it's not generosity. The thing about the magnanimous person is if they get a gift from somebody, that kind of implies that other person is better than the magnanimous person. So what they do is they turn around and they give them a bigger gift. make sure that they know that they're not as good as the magnanimous person. That's the point that they're
So like Elvis?
How so? Did Elvis do that?
Some lady baked him a cake once as a gift, and the next day he gave her his car.
I knew Elvis was an Aristotelian. So, is that in the movie?
I don't know, but he gave her his Cadillac.
Yeah, well, that's kind of generous. That might be, I don't know. So, it's interesting. I was just talking to a work colleague, and he was saying that Elvis was like, he got into some New Age stuff at the end of his life, but he did have a strong Christian faith at some points too, and that apparently there was a scene in one of his concerts where it was like some, crazy groupie was saying, "Oh, you're the king," and he stopped the concert and said, "I'm not the king. Jesus is the king." So it's kind of interesting. I don't know if that's true, but it sounds like a good story. But it's interesting. So yeah, so if Elvis, so that's the thing. Is Elvis being generous there, or is he being, being magnanimous? I think that's such a crazy exchange. It probably is being generous. And this is the interesting thing about ethics is that it's really kind of complicated, because if he's being generous, it's an awesome thing to do, and if he's trying to put her in her place, it's a horrible thing to do. It's these really small distinctions that make the meaning in a gesture. So the magnanimous person also wishes to be superior, and they look down on others, and they're open in hate and love. So if you meet a magnanimous person, according to Aristotle, they think they're better than you, they want to be better than you, and they'll tell you that they're better than you, right? It's not the most attractive way to go about in life. And this is really interesting. So self-sufficient. So that's what the magnanimous person, according to Aristotle, wants to be, self-sufficient. And so there's a contemporary philosopher named Alistair McIntyre. He's very elderly now, but he's taught at Notre Dame and a bunch of other places. And he's very much a follower of Aristotle, but he criticizes Aristotle for this. He says, philosophers are really bad on this, because the reality is there's no such thing as a self-sufficient person. So McIntyre wants to make this argument, but he's much smarter than I am. But he does it like a typical philosopher way, in a way that nobody can understand. So he wrote a book called Dependent Rational Animals. Does anybody know what a dependent rational animal is?
It's us.
What?
It's us.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It's a human being. So he might, so he's trying to make it as complicated as possible. But he's got a great point, is that the reality is, and this is something that philosophy has missed, Aristotle is this polymath, he's a genius, and he is a genius that's influenced the entire tradition. But the problem is that we are always dependent. There has never been a human that has been self-sufficient, ever. It's never existed. And most humans are radically dependent at birth, and radically dependent when they're elderly. And in the middle, when we're at the height of our strength right now, we're still very dependent on one another. So this is kind of, it's a fiction, actually. And it's a problematic fiction, because it actually obscures a lot of virtues that we should be pursuing, like virtues of generosity, virtues of gratefulness and thankfulness, and things along those lines. The virtues that help us, as individuals, form good relationships and form communities, so to speak. So this is the magnanimous person. A lot of philosophers have read this description and said, they say, he's joking, right? I mean, who would want to be like that? That's the height of virtue? Some kind of, very arrogant person, it sounds like Aristotle's painting this picture. In Aristotle's defense, I think what you have is, and this is a challenge for all philosophers and ethicists, is that you have some transcendent principles embedded in here, like being able to recognize your talents. That's something that's important to all of us, with culturally bound ideas. So what you see is all this other stuff. Like he even talks about how you have to be told to be magnanimous, you have to have a low voice, and you have to walk slowly, apparently, too. So this is all, he gets really into it. And but it's all stuff that a Greek aristocrat from 2,500 years ago that would look like. And so it's not very attractive. Some people think it's joking, other people think it's just horrible or whatever. So this other guy that I mentioned, David Hume, he's an 18th century historian and philosopher. And so he's a very influential guy, actually. But he recognized, he's with Aristotle. He says that the great people in history, they stride across the pages of history because they think they're awesome. They have this pride and self-esteem that is just dominant in their personality. But he recognized the problem is that people don't like that. The only thing an arrogant person doesn't like in another person is arrogance. It's just very unattractive. So Hume's solution to this is arrogance is obnoxious. So be proud on the inside, but just don't let anybody know. All right. So be and it's interesting. He chooses his words carefully. He says, "Be modest on the outside, but don't be humble. Humble is a vice for him." Because his criteria for virtues and vices are anything that's useful and makes you happy, so to speak, would be a virtue. Humility does not make you happy, and authentic humility is bad for you. So this is a question that I used to ask my classes, and I'll ask you too. If that's all right. So does that work? Does Hume's solution work? Aristotle plus Hume equals leadership? Any reactions to that? Yeah.
My first thought process is that what the fowls do is what comes out from the heart.
Right.
And so if you're prideful on the inside, your actions are still going to reflect that.
Okay.
It doesn't have the right intent.
Okay. So if you're proud on the inside, it's going to come out. Is that kind of what you're saying? Okay. Any other reactions? I think that's a great way to put it. And to be honest, this is why in the end I like theology better than philosophy, because it's much less cumbersome. You can really get directly to the point. But so where I was teaching, I was at the Naval Academy, and so I was teaching sophomores, and the sophomores have to do what the upper class is kind of like a military culture and organization in the dorms, and so they have to do what the upper class tell them to do, like the seniors are in charge and stuff like that. And I was like, so the seniors are called firsties, and so I asked them, have you ever met a firstie that pretends that they care about you, but all they really care about is themselves? And half the people are like, no, and other people are like, they're like, yeah. So, and the reality is that if they hadn't met them at that point, they will. You'll see a lot of people with Hume's description of leadership. But I think your point is absolutely well taken. Is that what's in your heart eventually will come out. And what's really interesting is that leader-follower relationships often are quite intimate. They're close proximity a lot of times, and so you can hide a lot of stuff, but not if over time that kind of thing will typically come out. But yeah.
Just kind of like building off of the Alexander the Great kind of example.
Yeah.
As soon as he deceased, all of his closest members went into wars with each other.
Right.
But
all fragmented.
Christ and the disciples did the opposite.
Yeah. No, it's a great point. It's interesting because when you talk about Christian leadership, a lot of times people say, well, that's an ideal that nobody's going to live. It's impossible to live out. But there's a really interesting quote. It's attributed to, of all people, Napoleon. And it was supposedly, so historians say, well, maybe he said it, maybe he did it, because he said it in his second exile. I forget which island he was exiled to. He sent it to his general or whatever. But he said, and he sounded pretty magnanimous in Aristotle's sense, because he was like, he's comparing himself to, Charlemagne and Caesar and him. What did what were our, how were our empires built? They were built on power and violence. But Christ, what was his empire built on? It was built on love. And he said, to this day, millions will die for Christ. It's like, for me, Caesar, don't care too much. So I think there's a real leadership insight into that too. That at best with Hume, you have an inauthentic relationship, but over time it won't last, basically. So it's kind of interesting. So it doesn't seem like it's a great answer. So let's turn to Lewis. So Lewis, so in his article, and this comes from Mere Christianity, he's talking about pride, and he's making some distinctions about humility. He's saying the humble person isn't necessarily lowly, but is self-forgetful. Pleasure in being praised isn't pride. So he was saying, you can have pride in your school, or be proud of your son or daughter or something along those lines. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Pride in your school is fine until you start saying, well, I'm better than other people because I want them to succeed or something like that, right? So that's where it can take it. And it's a subtle term, but it can take that term, right? So, and even pleasure in being praised isn't pride. So it's okay to be proud of something. But he says pride is the worst fault, and don't let it crowd out other faults. It leads to every other vice. So this is this really strong assertion. It's competitive. It's a pleasure in being above others. So there's a little overlap with Aristotle and magnanimity. It leads to enmity, and the proud cannot know God. And so he's really down on pride. And Aristotle seems to be really up on pride. So can we reconcile the two perspectives? No?
Making edits.
What's that?
Making edits.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because I think I don't want to. I think there is a tension there. There's obviously, and they're saying different things. But what's interesting is that I don't want to reduce that either. They definitely think differently, but they're not as opposed as one might think because of language, actually. So I was talking about this. So this is the Latin, right? So just to go to magnanimitas first. So that's a direct translation of the Greek, megalopsychos I mentioned earlier. So magna is great, anima is spirit, right? So great spirit. Superbia. Any idea what that is?
Superiority.
What's that?
Superiority.
Well, kind of. Yeah. To be honest, I think there's a root to that, but that's the Latin term for pride, right? So there's two different Latin words that we're talking about. So what's interesting is that pride, and the problem with pride in English is it's got baggage, it's got historical baggage from the Christian tradition that says all the stuff that C.S. Lewis just said, but it's ambiguous also. And so superbia has a very specific definition, and it is the sin of pride. And so superbia, or pride as a sin, is self-love, disordered self-love. And so it's not that you can't love yourself, but it's disordered self-love that puts the love of self above all other loves, up to and including love for God. That's superbia. That's the sin of pride. And so there's it's interesting. So we're using a text at the Naval Academy, which is supposed to be a great institution of higher learning, and we had a really bad translation actually. So it's kind of interesting, and so it kind of confuses the terms. So in the Catholic tradition, we have another resolution between magnanimity and humility, and St. Thomas does a really good job with it, and I think it's much better than Hume's interpretation. Hume basically says, be inauthentic and really be full of yourself. It's okay, don't worry about it, and you'll stride across the pages of history. I don't think that's, and to be honest, so this is the problem with ethics is that sometimes that can be true, but not most of the time. It's not generally true. There are exceptions. So St. Thomas puts in the context of those four cardinal virtues that I talked about at the beginning of the lecture. Magnanimity is a function of courage. Excuse me. It's the ability to act on your talent on the basis of, do great things that you might be scared to do. Humility is a part of self-control or temperance, which holds you back from things you ought not to be doing because you don't have the ability to do it. And so humility is really a rich virtue, actually. And I don't want to, not that I disagree with St. Thomas there, but I think, at the heart of humility is, I like Lewis's word of self-forgetful. Is that, so St. Augustine was a church father, a doctor of the church, lived 350 to 430, and so I spent a lot of time studying him. And so he's really interesting. So Father Schwager says Christ came to overturn this bad interpretation, this condemnatory interpretation of the law. St. Augustine said Christ came to earth to teach humility. He's very extreme on the issue. It's this, because our problem is pride. Our problem is self-love. This is the problem of the garden. This is the problem of the devil. This is the problem that leads to all the other problems from St. Augustine. So C.S. Lewis is really channeling St. Augustine. And so humility in this context is actually akin to it's kind of like a form of love, that the humble person is oriented towards love of other things, love of God, love of things along those lines. It doesn't necessarily mean that the humble person thinks poorly of themselves, but as Lewis says, they think less of themselves. They think about themselves less. So, and I think, I think that's at the core of humility. But there are a lot of other aspects of humility that we can talk about further. So going through all that, So is Jesus humble or proud in the good sense? Magnanimous, would you say?
Both.
Both. Yeah. See. All right. So you do well in my class because, like, if a philosopher or a theologian, if they ever ask you an either/or question, it's always both and. All right. So and there's a lot of scriptural evidence to say both. Why do you say both? Just because you're trying to be hard on me?
No, because just the way you've been describing pride and the way you've been articulating it as magnanimity, as like a good thing.
Right. So, and St. Thomas is calling it a virtue. So let's look at what is it? So let's look at the humility of Jesus first. I mean, so there's some scriptural evidence on this stuff. So the great hymn from Paul's letter to the Philippians, and I'm not going to dwell on that one because I'm going to come back to it in a little while. But the humility of Christ is all throughout the New Testament. And there's a theologian that says, so what another unique aspect of Christian revelation is the transcendent, all-powerful Creator of the universe is humble, and that's revealed not through the Old Testament but through the New Testament. And so we can see that in the manger scene in the Gospel of Luke. Gospel of John talks about it a little differently. The true light, which enlightens everyone, came into the world. He was in the world, and the world came to be through him, but the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, but his own people did not accept him. So there's kind of a humility and even a humiliation to that, but the humiliation actually gets worse. So it's interesting. So Jesus teaches humility. He says, rather, when you are invited, go and take the lowest place so that at the table, so that when the host comes to you, he may say, my friend, move up to a higher position. Then you will enjoy the esteem of your companions at the table. So this is an interesting line to me because I can't remember where my wallet or my keys are on a daily basis. You can attest to that. We were talking about 10 to 1. I forget that my bag is in that corner. But I remember this very clearly. It was in 2012. I was doing my dissertation defense, and so dissertation defense is you do this long paper, and then you present it in front of a bunch of people who are much smarter than you, and you're really scared, and you hope that you don't make a fool of yourself. So as I was driving in, I was listening to the radio, and so this is during the Obama administration, and President Obama was at Baruch Women's College in Manhattan, giving the commencement speech, and he literally said the opposite. He said, don't sit at the foot of the table, take your seat, grab the head of the table. So it's really interesting. Is that I would offer that that's worldly wisdom, and that's very different from gospel wisdom. So I'll just that's my only political comment on that. But it's interesting. So he's teaching humility. He says, unless you become like children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. And to remember, like children at this time in culture, very interesting. Children are valued much more in our culture. Not to say that we're perfect on the way we see children, but we value children much more than the ancient communities do. So for him to say this is very striking. It's like, were you crazy? Like in families, you had obligations to your parents. You didn't have obligations to your children in a lot of cultures. So that was very striking for him to say. So he said, and then this is the classic teaching on leadership. The Gentiles lord it over you, but it shall not be so among you. Whoever wishes to be great among you will be your servant. Whoever wishes to be first among you will be slave of all. So Jesus' explicit teaching on leadership. He lives it. When he comes to be baptized, this is really interesting. So this is again, I'm reading this in St. Augustine interprets that passage, and he's like, that's because he was teaching humility. That's why Jesus get baptized. From a theological perspective, he doesn't need to be baptized. Baptism forgives people of their original sin, brings them into the church. Well, he doesn't have any sin, and he is the church. So it's not like he really needs to be baptized, right? It doesn't make any sense. But St. Augustine says he's teaching people. He's coming to the proud to teach them humility. And so that's why he's doing that. I would also say that he's leading by example. It's another way to think about it. And humility is a big part of that. This is really interesting. Jesus' high point, even as triumphant entry into Jerusalem, he's still riding on a donkey. So even at his high point in his public ministry, there's still an aspect of humility to it. And then lastly, and too long to list on the slide, the passion narratives and the humiliation of the cross. And it is really interesting is that it's one thing, people know that humility is attractive. We hang around people that are really full of themselves. We don't really like hanging around with them. But people who are humble, they're very attractive personalities. So we respond well, I think, generally to humility. Humiliation is very different, I think. And it's interesting because I talk a good game on humility. I don't know if I'm willing to be humiliated. Excuse me, as I spit across the room. But that's what Jesus takes on the cross. Right? It's not just pain and suffering, but humiliation, at the hands of his enemies, so to speak. That's what he's willing to do. So he lives humility. So Jesus is humble, but he's magnanimous also, right? So just a couple of examples again. So he's correcting Moses. So that's so he thinks he's better than Moses, this guy, right? So that's very controversial, and he obviously has a high view of himself if he's doing that. And then he says stuff like this: everyone who listens to these words of mine, acts on them, will be like a wise man who built his house on rock. The rain fell, floods came, winds blew and buffeted the house, but it did not collapse. And it had been set solidly on rock. And everyone who doesn't listen to me is a fool. So, okay, so he's got a pretty strong view of his wisdom. At the judgment, the queen of the south will rise up and condemn the men of this generation. She will condemn them because she came from the ends of the earth to hear Solomon. And there's something greater here than Solomon. Nineveh will rise against this generation, condemning because of the preaching of Jonah. They repented. There's something greater here than Jonah. I'm better than Jonah. I'm better than Solomon. But it gets worse. So this is he sees himself as the fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, and rolling up the scroll, he handed it back to the attendant. And this is in the synagogue, sat down. Everybody's looking at him, and he says, "Today this scripture passage is fulfilled in your hearing." And then he says, "Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away." He is the gate. He's the only person that enables people to come to the Father. So I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, even if he dies, will live. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. From now on, I am telling you before it happens, so that when it happens, you can believe that I am. So these I am phrases. Does anybody know what he's referencing there? Yeah. So this is Yahweh, God Almighty. He's saying he's identifying. So who does this guy think he is? He literally thinks he's God. So that's pretty magnanimous in a Thomistic or Aristotelian sense, right? And it's interesting because that drives his actions. Both aspects, the humility and the magnanimity, drive his actions. So, okay. And I don't know how am I doing on time? Good. Okay. All right. I'll try and go through this quick. So back to glory. So I want to take a look at glory in the context of Jesus' magnanimity and humility. So I just thought this was funny. I'm not sure if it's really related or not. So, but the thing is that self-centered leaders, they usually end up being bad ones. So that's how it's related. And this guy's not a good leader, right? Okay. So, but we have to. There's a paradox here, and there are a lot of paradoxes when it comes to, say, the moral vision of the New Testament, and also that vision in regard to leadership. One is if you want to be master, you have to be the servant, right? So that's a paradox. The paradox with glory is that if you're pursuing your own glorification, you're going to fail to achieve it. It's the person that doesn't care about glory that has a chance to reap it, so to speak. But let's just talk about glory in the biblical revelation just very briefly. So it's a theme that comes up. You see it in the Old Testament with Moses. Moses is the friend of God, and he's in communication and conversation with God, so much so that the glory of the Lord radiates from his face. So I don't know if people are familiar with this. It's the book of Exodus where he comes down from the mountain. He's got to wear a veil because he's freaking everybody out because his face is glowing, right? So that's the glory of the Lord. And it's interesting. It's very similar in the Transfiguration. So you have the glory of the Lord is manifest in light and fear. And so the transfiguration, you have Jesus transfigured. And it's really interesting is that you have these in all the Gospels, and then St. Peter actually in his second letter, he has a reference to the transfiguration also. It's kind of interesting. But you have, he's transfigured in light, and the apostles are their main reaction is fear. But that's not the only way that glory is represented in the gospel. So you have in John's gospel 2 examples of this, where the wedding feast at Cana is that Jesus turns the water into wine, and so what the gospel says is that this is the first of his signs that reveals his glory, right? And so then Jesus cures the blind man, the man born blind, and that's done to show the glory of God, the glorification of God. So glory is this manifestation of God's power in the world, and it's also a manifestation of God's power to help humans, to save humans, to show His love for humanity. And so that's God's greatest glory. Actually, is His ability to save us from ourselves, so to speak. And you see that again a little later in John's Gospel. So chapter 12 in John's Gospel is kind of a turning point in the narrative. And actually, so right before the grain of wheat line, what you see is that the disciples come and say, hey, it's not just the Jews that want to talk to you now, it's the Gentiles. They want to start talking to you. And so Jesus says, in the first 11 chapters, he's talking about, my hour is not come. Like actually the wedding feast, he says to his mother, what have you to do with me, woman? My hour is not come yet. I mean, it's a common phrase in the first half of the gospel. So this is the turning point. He says, my hour is come, that the Son of Man will be glorified. And literally, so that's verse 23. The hour for the glorification of the Son of Man has arrived. In verse 24, he says, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces much fruit. And so the glory of the Lord is now presented definitively in the New Testament as the suffering and sacrifice of Christ to save humanity. And so between John 24, this is John 32, you have a series of dialogue between the Son and the Father saying, and Jesus is reflecting upon the path he's about to trod, and he's not all that happy about it because it's going to be a path of suffering. And he says, what am I going to say? Relieve me of these duties. This is the whole reason I came. And the Father responds, that this is your glory, and we are glorifying one another in this process. I don't have good. It's not a great summary of the actual text, but Jesus says, Father, glorify your name, and the Father responds, I have glorified it, and I will glorify it. And then Jesus says, and this is an interesting, it's kind of an interesting leadership image here, is that when he's lifted up, he will draw everyone to himself. And so the glory of God to save humanity in the New Testament comes by way of suffering and sacrifice. So this is a quote that I really have found compelling in the past. It's by a theologian, 20th century theologian, big name, Hans Urs von Balthasar. He's from Switzerland, so I guess they have long names there. But he was a very humble priest, and he said, I don't want to be disrespectful trying to get into the mindset of our Lord, but he said this is the way he probably saw himself. I am the one through whom the kingdom of God must and will come. And what's really interesting about that is, and it's really scripturally based, which we'll see in a second, but it's also a line that applies to all of Jesus' followers too. But within that, you have both humility and magnanimity. The humility to go through suffering, death, and humiliation. It can't be done. The glory of God cannot be achieved without the sacrifice of the cross. But then you also have the magnanimity to say, I am the Son of God, and I am the one that's going to achieve this mission. And so what's interesting about getting back to this idea of glory is that if a leader is concerned about their self-glorification, it'll slip through their fingers, so to speak. But that's not what Christ is concerned about. And this is what he's concerned about. This is his mindset, which is given to us in Luke's gospel. And I think this is the basis for Father von Balthasar's quote. But he says, "I've come to set the earth on fire, and how I wish it were already burning. There is a baptism by which I must be baptized, and how great is my anguish until it is accomplished." And so it's interesting. This is the key to all the reckless stuff he does in the gospel narratives. That's what's behind it. It's really interesting. But he's not desiring glory; he's desiring mission. That's what matters. And if he was desiring his own glory, guess what? It's kind of like what Hume was saying. Nobody's going to follow somebody who cares about themselves first and other people second. But people are going to follow someone who's focused on the mission, especially when the mission is helping them, so to speak. Right. So a couple last. So this yields. This is the fundamental paradox of Christ's glory, and we're all familiar with with Paul's hymn. So I won't read the whole thing, but it's through humility that Christ is exalted. So there's this paradoxical relationship, and I think that's manifested in the leadership of Jesus also that we were talking about. Also, there's a lot to it. Love is central to it also. But humility leads to exaltation, leads to glorification, but only if you're focused on the mission rather than glory itself. So I was searching the internet to find a good slide to represent that last point, and I was like searching for being not being self-interested, and all I came in was all this self-help stuff that kept on saying you are wonderful. So this was one of the ones. This is not what I was looking for. You're amazing. In case you forget, right? So that's again maybe worldly wisdom, but I found a different one that's more to the point. So for the point for us, if we want to be leaders, I think, is to follow that pattern. Focus on the mission. That's what matters. Leave your self-interest out of it. And the paradox is that you may be glorified. If you do it well, you may be glorified, but that doesn't matter. It's focusing on the mission. So that's my spiel. And so I think it went a little longer than I anticipated, but I'm not sure. Where are we at?
Fine, 7:05.
Okay. So I'm happy to take questions or comments. If you want to tell me how good looking I am, I'm very open to that. If you want to say how dumb this is, I'm very open to that too. My wife tells me stuff like that all the time. So, but I'd love to get your questions or comments or whatever you want to say. Yeah.
I had a question going back toward the beginning.
Yeah, sure.
You mentioned the time when Jesus, in all four Gospels, went into the temple and drove out the money changers and the wild animals.
Right.
And afterwards he used the line, "Quit making my Father's house a marketplace."
Right.
I'm kind of interested in the translation behind that, from whether it was Greek or Latin or wherever it came from. Why does it say "our Father's house"? Why doesn't he say "our Father's house"? If he would have done that, he might have gotten more support behind it.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I'd have to do the research. I don't know. It's a really I'm glad that you're making that distinction though, because it's an interesting distinction, because you have so Christ is the eternal Son of the Father, and so obviously he's unique in that regard, but he's also creating a family and calling us brothers and sisters, so to speak. Who's my mother and my brother and my sister, or those who do the will of my Father in heaven. So it's interesting is that, and this is just my own speculation, which means it's probably full of baloney. But there's, what's nice about, what's interesting about Christ, the person of Christ in the incarnation is he's truly human, right? And so there's a real, in Christian anthropology, which is, the Christian understanding of the human person, is based on Trinitarian theology, and that the height of creation, the height of existence, the great pinnacle is personal existence, and we see it in the relationships of the Holy Trinity, and we're created in the image and likeness of that Holy Trinity, and so that's our great dignity in the Christian context. And so it's interesting is that the way he phrases that in Scripture is highly personal. It's that it's not just our Father there. It's my Father, and so that happened in particular. I think you're talking about John's Gospel, in John's Gospel, you see Jesus say over and over and over and over again, there's this complete dedication and commitment to the Father. Like a dozen times he says, I've come here not to do my will, but the Father's will. So it's interesting. I wonder if that kind of, for lack of a better term, emotion and passion is why it's said my rather than our. And I don't know if you have, it's a great question. I don't know if you have any reactions to that.
I just wanted to answer question about that. I think some of it, knowing zero things about the translation, is we become children of God once we're baptized. And before that, we aren't children of God. We're creatures, we're beloved creatures, but we aren't beloved children. It's baptism that washes that original sin, gives us the sanctifying grace. And at that point, we become children. And so I don't know if people were baptizing others with the Trinitarian formula until after Jesus' death and passion and resurrection. And so technically, they wouldn't have been children of God yet. Beloved creatures, yes, but because they hadn't been baptized into the family of God, God wouldn't necessarily be their father.
I was going to say the same.
Okay, all right. I'll come back to you, but yeah.
Well, there's a comment about this conversation. I think that's fine. I have a separate question.
Okay, yeah. Do you want to?
Yeah, rephrase the question.
Yeah, sure.
I didn't mean it from a theological standpoint. I meant it from someone was a public speaker that went up
right.
What's the way they're going to get most of the crowd on their side? Is
right.
it try and make them angry, or try and say we're all in this together? You were trying to lead people to think that you do that.
Yeah, it's interesting. What I think is in some ways, he was very happy. At times, he would say things to obviously draw people in, but he was also very willing to say things in a way that they probably wouldn't find attractive. Like if you look at, he promises suffering to everybody. Like, who wants to suffer? And he's like, if you follow me, you're going to suffer. And so it's kind of like, it's not really all that attractive. What was the other thing? Instance. Oh yeah, John 6 with the bread of life's discourse. At the end of it, they're like, this is nuts, and he's like, all right, you want to leave? This is the truth, right? So it's kind of interesting. Is that at some points he does kind of draw a line in the sand. I don't know if I'd have to read more of that passage to make a strong stand on that. So all right, so you had your hand up.
Yeah, so
we'll get to you guys.
I've been thinking about this question for a while, but kind of in light of leadership, how should a Christian go about pursuing opportunities of leadership? Because we have Pope Benedict in one example where he didn't want to be elected Pope, but he was elected, but also in full machine, actively pursuing and putting himself out there.
Right. Yeah, it's a great question. It's interesting. So I'll make it personal. I can see it in two of my sons, actually. So you can tell. Don't say anything to Patrick and Liam. But it's really interesting is that, so they both, one graduated from the Naval Academy, one's in the Naval Academy. So the Naval Academy, you have this, at senior year, you can become what's called stripers. And it's basically, you have to, just to put it frankly, kiss a lot of rear ends, and you get the stripes, and you have the rank, and you can boss people around. So it attracts not the nicest people. And so my older son, he was like, I don't want anything to do with that. And in a lot of ways, I didn't blame him. My younger son is interested in doing it. And I think there's a good reason to be interested in doing it. It's that if you let all the people who are attracted to that kind of stuff end up competing and getting the leadership jobs, guess what? Everybody's miserable. So you need good people to pursue those leadership jobs, really. But I think that's so much. Your two examples are awesome. Pope Benedict is a really interesting guy because he never. And this is from a professor of mine that knew him. He was like, he never wanted to be in Rome. He never wanted to be in charge of the congregation for the doctrine of the faith. But the Pope asked him to do it, so he was like, of course. And then and it was just actually. One of the cardinals just came out that when he got elected Pope, he was like, apparently almost having like a panic attack, and one of the cardinals said, "Hey, God's calling you to do this. God will support you," and that helped him through. So here's a person that was put into leadership positions that it was not his first desire. Where and I don't know the history about Archbishop Sheen as much, but just to say that he's kind of a contrast. And I think that's the interesting thing about the church. And St. Paul talks about we all have our talents and gifts from God, and so we have to really in our prayer life say, what do you want me to do with this stuff? It's interesting for me. I'm like a total introvert. I hate getting up in front of people and talking, but whatever. It's what I think God's calling me to do. So here I am. But so that's, I think, is it differs according to the way the Spirit touches each person's hearts. But I think it's a great question. So you had your hand up too.
So I'm kind of along the same line as him. I'm just thinking about how do you reconcile this fact that yes, we should recognize greatness in ourselves, and then you see a bunch of saints being I am miserable, I'm wicked, I'm awful, and running away from
Yeah, that's a great question, because there are many examples of that, and I would say the saints are holy because they one of the reasons they are is because they have such humility and they have a clear view of their flaws. But hey, have you ever met a saintly person that they say they're so horrible, but they're better than everybody you know? I think that's the phenomenon that's going on with the saints. I think to be honest, and I'll just go out on a limb here, I'm very much a traditionalist, so it's not like I want to go around criticizing saints. But I think a view of humility that says, I'm horrible, I'm worthless, I'm lowly, there's a truth to that, in that's true in our relationship to God. There's a priest named Father Walter Chiswick. Has anybody ever heard of him? He's a Jesuit, and he's written 2 books. He passed away in 1980. One book was With God in Russia. This is biography. He basically went to Poland right before World War II. He wanted to minister to Russia. He was locked out, and then the war started and he got engulfed. And within a month, they captured him, said he was a spy from the Vatican, put him in solitary confinement for 5 years, spent 15 years in Siberia. So, interesting guy. But he's very simple with humility. He's you will be humble if you have an authentic relationship with God, because you'll see His grandeur as opposed to your lowliness. But I think if you're saying always that I'm worthless, but that's probably not well balanced, even if some of the saints are doing it, because the reality is we're created in the image and likeness of God, and so there has to be that counterbalance. That I think they're speaking about the depths of their sorrow, where they may have hurt their relationship with their Lord, but the truth is that they probably have extraordinary virtues also, because they wouldn't necessarily name themselves as saints, but they couldn't be saints without those virtues. So I think there has to be a balance there to a certain extent for us. But I think there are examples, right, too. Is the more you start thinking, you can't be magnanimous without being humble. And if you spend too much time thinking about yourself, it's problematic. That turn from being innocent, I'm proud of my school, to aren't I cool because I went to the school, it's a very easy turn to make. So I think humility, saints have a good example of humility in the foreground to prevent that turn to pride, if that makes sense.
To what extent is this concept, specifically this one up here, it's in your best interest to forget your self-interest, overlaps with kind of the idea of disinterested righteousness from the wisdom literature of Job and Ecclesiastes?
I think there's a lot of overlap to that, actually, and that disinterested righteousness is kind of like I think there's a parallel between that and the Augustinian humility that I was talking about previously. Is that and so for and again, and here's Lewis's formulation too. That, the humble person isn't some necessarily some lowly, unconfident person. It's somebody who's not really focused on themselves. So that disinterested righteousness is a similar phenomenon, and it's a very high standard of morality too, because we're all self-interested, and to a certain extent that's natural, and it can even be praiseworthy. It often leads to unpraiseworthy actions, but having that that disinterested stance towards what's truly good is really important to be able to do what's good when it's hard, because often the good things are the hardest things to do. Yeah.
How might we be able to separate the magnanimous thoughts from pusillanimous thoughts?
Yeah.
And the false humility, true humility in our own lives.
Yeah. So what I just said about the saints is probably, look at the saints as an example. That's the thing is that I think we have a tendency to compare ourselves to other people, and that's usually not a great criteria for us to pursue, because and it's the problem of social media. So stuff on Facebook and Snapchat and Instagram, it's half of reality. It's all the happy part for the most part, and the other half is well, I'm not going to. We don't need. Well, there's some people that actually flash the other half, but most people don't. And so if we're constantly comparing ourselves to other people, we might think we're worse than them. We might think they're better than them. And so I think that, and it's not like we'll ever stop doing that to a certain extent. But I think what you want to, when you're thinking about yourself, and this is interesting because this is the union of humility and magnanimity, is they're both self-regarding habits. And so that's kind of the crossover, and I think they are different habits, because magnanimity is looking at your strengths, which is usually a happy thing. Humility is looking at your weaknesses and your flaws, and usually not as happy. So there's different emotions associated with each action. But I think looking at those things in the context of your relationship with God, in a prayer life, that's where you're going to get the most clarity and truth, because one is you get your dose of humility, as Father Chiswick talks about. It's that you're not God, but also that you are, although you have flaws and sin, you're also redeemed and intrinsically valuable, not only because we've been told we're created in the image and likeness of God, but because we have a Savior that literally gave His life for us. That's how valuable we are. So I think that the best way to look at your strengths and look at your weaknesses in the context of your relationship with God. So, and Scripture is great on all this stuff too. So as you read through Scripture and you meditate on it, it's a great way to come to a good self-understanding of the pluses and minuses. And probably the worst way, no offense to all our social media people, is on social media, right? So I don't know. I hope that's helpful. Good question. That was a hard one.
Sure. Wanted to add to that, I think another thing is if you have a sense of peace about it as well. Like when you're thinking so low games and get caught up into that, there is no peace, right?
Right.
But if you understand your lowliness in the context of God and His mercy, then you have this overwhelming amount of peace.
Right.
And so I think that's also very much into how of your relationship with God.
Yes.
That's how I kind of use it as a metric.
Yeah, that's a great point. Bringing in mercy into that reflection, I think, is very, very helpful. Yeah.
Kind of adding on to that too, there's an aspect of understanding the role of suffering and its redemptive value that kind of helps in, I don't know how to say that P word, for lack of better words, that negative
It's not a four-letter word either.
It's often enough thinking oneself as lowly is a product of circumstance, a product of context, and uniting that back to the mission and the redemptive value of it kind of itself redeems whatever circumstances happen.
Other comments, questions? I do want to make a shout out. I noticed one of my brother knights is here in the third row, so thanks so much for coming. So that's my day job. So I'm working with the Knights of Columbus I was doing leadership and ethics education at the Naval Academy, retired, and was able to basically do the same stuff with the Knights of Columbus, which are big organizations. So thanks for coming.
Thanks for being here.
And well, without any ado, I'll be hanging around. So if you want to talk to me individually, I'm happy to do that. But I guess we can call it quits.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this lecture on the Thomistic Institute podcast. The generosity of people like you makes this podcast possible. If you enjoy these talks, please consider showing your support at www.thomisticinstitute.org/donate. Your donation of even $1 helps us reach more college students and many others with the powerful truths of the faith, and it ensures that we can keep publishing top-notch lectures on this podcast. Thanks a lot.